Good morning, do take a seat. Today marks the first Sunday of Advent and is also celebrating across the diocese Youth Sunday, which is part of the reason why I'm speaking to you today. And the first Advent candle. Advent is a time when we look forward to Jesus Christ's return, as well as when we look back to his arrival that we celebrate at Christmas. And the first candle represents the patriarchs, the founding fathers of our faith. And so today we started with the narrative of the Tower of Babel. And that was in Genesis 11. And really, God had not given too many instructions or commands to people. But one of the instructions he gave was to spread out and to fill the land. And this tower was an act of rebellion. It was let's build a tower. Let's make a name for ourselves. Let's not get separated. Let's not follow God's plan. Let's make our own way. And this tower of rebellion, we find God has a simple solution to end it, and that is to confound their language and confuse their speak. It's interesting to note that we don't actually know any of the names of the people who tried to build that tower. It said they tried to write them on all the bricks so people would know for longevity whose effort it was. But a name we do know is the name of Abraham. So very soon after this mess of human rebellion, God wanted to choose a people and a nation to represent himself, to be a light to the whole world. And he chooses a very unlikely candidate, because I might choose the most athletic race. I would have chosen maybe the most advanced technologically race. I might have chosen a people who are more numerous than anyone else to give myself a winning chance at these people being a leading light. But God chose a 75-year-old man who was impotent and had no children. His wife was also barren. So God chooses the unlikely person of Abraham, and he meets him straight away in the place of weakness. You see, his name was Abram, meaning father, which was quite ironic when names are important and you don't have any children. He had no inheritance to give his children, or he had an inheritance, but he had no one to give it to. And so God gives Abraham this promise: follow me, go to where I will send you, and I will make you a great nation. So Abraham trusts God, and he leaves behind his home, he leaves behind his comfort, his familiar surroundings, and he follows God. It's in a place of weakness, a place that would have troubled Abraham for years and years. He would have seen every day, every time someone called his name, Abraham, father, he would have remembered, I don't have any children. I have failed in that area of my life. I am insufficient. And it's in those places that God often meets us to work out his power. And as we follow the story on, God indeed makes Abram a great nation. He in fact changes his name to Abraham, meaning father of many. And so God's salvation plan works through him. And I'm looking forward to next year when we're going to do the Mission of God series, where we're going to look at the Bible narrative, the big picture of God's salvation plan and how it works through the Bible. Maybe you're an unlikely person that God is using or has chosen to use. And it's really based on God's choosing, not our credentials or our natural ability. Because Abraham had no natural ability to fulfill God's promise on his own. And he had to be patient. He had to wait 24 years. It wasn't until he was 99 that he had the child that he was waiting for. We're going to be starting an initiative called Open the Book at St John's Primary School, which I'm very excited about. And we had over 20 volunteers meet in the week. It's where we make the Bible stories come alive in assemblies. And this is what Sue Hughes, a 72-year-old from Wales, says about Open the Book. I think this is God's outrageous plan. I have always been an entrepreneur, but to get a group of elderly people dressed up in bed sheets and with tea towels on their heads and get them to share the Bible with children. If you were sitting in a strategy meeting, you would never have come up with this. It shouldn't work, but the fact that it does suggests it must be God's plan. So we are very excited about that, and it's a great example of God raising up unlikely people. And those unlikely people reach 250,000 children every week with the truths of the Bible. That is fantastic. We run many things in the schools, but also next year we are going to become a Scouts base again. In our past, we were a Scouts base here for over 50 years, and in January, Ollie Margery, who comes to the 9:30 service, is going to start getting the gears in motion for us to again become a Scout base. We have a parent and toddler group which had over 60 people turn up last week, and all these things are great vehicles, but they're empty without prayer and a vision of what God could do. Abraham got hold of the vision God gave him, that he said, look at the stars, as many as you can see the stars in the sky shall your descendants be. So we have to try and get God's vision, God's plan for our area, for Meads, for Eastbourne, and how he would like to use us, however unlikely it may seem. God's got a sense of humour. Maybe we're an unlikely church, being one of the oldest parishes in the country. I think that's God's challenge, to make us a beacon of hope to young people. God's plan of using unlikely volunteers and people runs all the way through the Bible. We will find more of that next year. But if we jumped to the New Testament, to the book of Acts, we would see God's next candidate. So we've reached the stage in history where Christianity really is belief in Jesus, and the gospel is being promoted by a very small number of Jewish people. And God wanted the gospel to spread far and wide. So God's next candidate is breathing out murderous threats towards the disciples. He is rounding up Christians and putting them in jail. It is Saul, or as we know him, Saint Paul. And God blinds him on a journey to Damascus, and he says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And this is a phenomenal example of God's love and mercy. He could have been angry with Saul. What are you doing to my people? He could have cast judgment on him, but instead he chooses to make the most unlikely of candidates one of the greatest missionaries, miracle workers, evangelists, theologians that the world has ever seen. And he revealed that God in fact knew his name. He knew him already. And that's something we can all take away, that God knows our names. The hair of our head is numbered. We are known by God. We are precious to him. So he, like Abraham, has an amazing encounter with God. But other people weren't quite so convinced that Paul had really changed, because Paul had been rounding up Christians. He'd been quite happy to see Stephen stoned. He was an enemy of the church. So who do we not accept because we do not like the packaging? Who do we underestimate or discount because of the packaging that God has put them in? We need to value and encourage people, however unlikely they seem, even if that includes ourselves. Paul wrote this wonderful phrase in a letter to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 1:27. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. Also in our gospel reading, we heard that Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." God's kingdom is an upside-down kingdom in priorities. It shows that his promises rest on his power, not our ability to perform. His love depends on him, not our behaviour. And there's an African proverb that goes, it takes a village to raise a child. It's our community responsibility to be leading lights in example, in love, in embracing young people, in embracing these initiatives. Maybe you're an unlikely person to help young people. Maybe you're an unlikely person to pray for young people. But I think that's where God works best. And God gets into all these people's identities. Our name represents who we are. For example, if I say the words Donald Trump, that I can see a few smiles, it invokes some sort of reaction because he stands for certain things, not things we would all agree with. So Abram becomes Abraham. He becomes father to father of many nations. Saul and Paul is an interesting one. So Saul was his Jewish name. Saul was very proud of his Jewish heritage. He knew God had called his people out to be a light to the world, to be an example of God, of what he was like. But he also had a Roman citizenship which allowed him to be called Paul. Saul was very passionate about his God-given calling of reaching people that weren't Jewish with the news about Jesus. So he was quite happy to drop his heritage and pride in being called Saul and being known as Paul, and we all know him generally as Saint Paul, because of his passion to identify with Christ and be able to reach out to people who weren't Jewish. So how do we go from being a group of unlikely people to being used by God? Well, I think it's simply we make ourselves available. We say yes to whatever God is calling us to, however unlikely we feel, however unlikely the plan from God seems. I would love to sit in God's strategy meetings. They must seem hilarious. We can take comfort from Paul, we can take comfort for Abraham, that God knows us by name, He's got a plan for our lives, and that if we pray to Him, if we make ourselves available, we can be part of that great plan and see amazing things happen in our time. I will just finish with a prayer. Please, God, help us to trust in You, to look to You, to raise our prayers to the God of heaven and not simply the situation we see or find ourselves in. Help us to say yes and be available to You and trust You with our lives. Amen.